I am Gregory Castera. With Sandra Terjman, I run a curatorial platform called Council. Council produces researches, which means that we don't know what is the final format of the work that the work will be when we begin. We experiment the composition between different forms of knowledge related to social issues. This knowledge comes from the physical and human science, the arts, and also from different professional and daily practice related to an issue. We think that a better composition between this knowledge allows for better political representation of an issue to come into being. The research this lecture encompasses and investigates the different abilities in hearing and listening. It started in 2013 in a school for deaf persons, and slowly it involved several academics, artists, and representatives from the un- and para-hearing entities, whether biological or technical. This diversity of perspective creates a space to think the politics of hearing and to contribute to an alternative to the natural history of hearing. Through this research, we published an online essay, and we initiated several collaborations that will lead to the production of new works by sound artist Tara Katoui and a choreographer Noé Soulier. So in September 2016, we will present this research for the Bergen Biennale in Norway, and it will be an exhibition, but we are currently working on the format. The exhibition will show a selection of technical, natural, artistic materials that belongs to those different worlds within hearing and listening. It will also be a place for observation and production of knowledge. So this lecture is thought to give to the audience, an impression of the research and of the future exhibition. It is the first time we perform it, so it is also an experiment. So the sign language interpreter Elke Schamberger will interpret in Austrian Sign Language a selection of different genres of text read aloud in English by Emma McCormick-Goodhart with the co-curator of the exhibition. So these texts are written by Denis Diderot, Louis Stern, Michel Friedner, Stefan Elmreich, Sophie Woolley, John Varley, Veit Ellman. You have the list of the different tracks, different number in the paper. And in the last sequence, Elke will interpret a selection of images, of materials from the future exhibition in gestures. Thus, Elke's role is slightly different than the one she used to. By focusing on a gesture, while also hearing the text, you will associate two different languages. Neurologists have discovered that the same part of the brain is stimulated when seeing gestures and when hearing something. So we will train how to hear through movement, as well as how to dissociate hearing from a purely mental activity. By presenting this artifact, this lecture also uses Elke's hand as a site for the future exhibition.
I used to frequent the theatre, and I knew by heart most of our best plays. On the days when I meant to examine actions and gestures, I would climb to the gallery, for the further I was from the actors, the better. As soon as the curtain was raised, and the rest of the audience disposed themselves to listen, I put my fingers in my ears, much to the astonishment of my neighbors. Not knowing my motives, they looked on me as a madman who only came to the play to miss it. I paid no attention to their remarks and kept my fingers obstinately in my ears, as long as the gestures and actions of the actor corresponded with the dialogue which I remembered. When I was puzzled by the gestures, I took my fingers from my ears and listened. Ah, how few actors there are who can stand such a test, and how humiliated the majority would be if I were to give the world my criticisms. But judge of my neighbors' surprise when they saw me shed tears at the pathetic passages, though I had my fingers in my ears. That was too much for them, and even the least inquisitive began to question me. But I coolly answered that everybody had his own way of listening, and mine was to shut out my ears to hear the better, and found some silent amusement in the comments caused by my real or apparent eccentricity, and in the simplicity of some young people who also tried putting their fingers in their ears to hear as I did, and were surprised at their lack of success. Whatever you may think of my expedient, pray consider that if, to judge correctly of intonation, we must listen to an actor without looking at him, it is very natural to watch an actor without hearing him, if we are to judge correctly of his actions and gestures. Some childhood friends of hers had told her that her laugh sounded like a horse's neigh. I could hear more than she could and told her that it didn't sound like a horse, but I couldn't hear well enough to know exactly what it did sound like. They just stared, and we never really felt we had any kind of handle on what was behind their bewilderment. People would call it pure sound, and we wondered if it was pure because we couldn't hear it. It was like an imaginary friend that everyone could see except for you, who insisted on attaching itself to you with gooey suction lips, and who everyone liked better than you. They were all talking, chattering over me. As a child, I had longed to be able to overhear, not anymore, usually. I wondered if it was because she could speak that she knew how to deposit the sorrow outside herself so efficiently. That was the part I envied. Men always want silent women, he said. You two are the perfect women. You are beautiful and no words come out to spoil the fantasy, and you can never hear the filth that is said around you. Completely untouched, untouchable, men would pay anything you wanted to be with you. I know, even if I often don't want to believe it, that it is true what he said about the specific quality of our silence. It is potential and it remains only potential. It is like water, the liquid clear and thin, something you can hold, but not hold down in any way. That is the silence that surrounds me and Ava always. She loved the solid language that the deaf shared, but she longed for the subtleties in the books she read constantly, the subtleties she was sure hearing people knew how to give one another. On days out of the deaf kids, walked in lines behind the hearing teachers. The hearing teachers occupied themselves by telling the deaf kids to behave, because if they didn't, people would think deaf people were retarded as well. Do you want people to think that you're animals? But talking to them left her even more hungry. It was like an addiction that could never be satisfied, always clinging onto the delusion that the next word, the next conversation, the next person would be the time when she would find a way to make her words flow without suffocating her. Her idea of this person, squeezing the air out of it. But their words squirted and dashed away so quickly and pushed her further and further away from any sense of them. In the morning after a party, she would reread a conversation she'd had and wonder what it meant, what remained of it in the daylight, what was solid. In a way, she never had to wonder when she talked to people in sign language. It wasn't because deaf people were better people or more honest. It was just because she could hold on to the solidity of their language. She didn't know how to hang on to written language outside of books. She was happy in the refuge in her head. She loved the city, but it made her feel strangely and pathetically apologetic sometimes because she had no noise of her own to match it with. "Don't you know I don't understand anything you say?" she signed to him, the tears almost visible now. "Don't you know you are as ridiculous to me as I am to you?" Being on the boat, separated from the city, and having the water and space around them all the time made it harder to ignore. Sometimes she looked so long that the horizon, the line that she could see between the flats on the other side of the river, disappeared. When you look so long at something, it just goes away. The silence was nuanced, not blank and dead. It was mischievous and sly, and full of a sadness that managed not to be melancholy. She would laugh to herself when the silence tickled her, which was often. His words looked pathetically dead on the page. She didn't know what she could do about that. For a long time, Beth believed that hearing people had a strange scent all their own. Both of them seemed to be outside everything, but actually they were outside language and ideas. Sometimes in certain solitary moments, she thought she could reach this place, like a pool you could dive into and stay submerged in, letting the water play over your body forever. It was like trying to jump over your own shadow or escape from it. Could you? She thought so. The huge gap between what was being said and what was happening underneath excited and scared her. The priest always came over and tried to start a conversation, and that was when he always left. If he had a voice, he sure could kill a hell of a lot of time. In both sound and deaf studies, a clean division is often assumed between hearing and deafness. In sound studies, for example, deafness becomes a ready and oldest figure for critical inattention. Ari Kelman's Rethinking the Soundscape, a critical genealogy of a key term in sound studies, suggests that attending to sound can amplify critical aspects of social and cultural life that otherwise fall on deaf ears. Hearing, deafness, and seeing operate as ideal types, which downplays continuums between and multiplicities of sensory capabilities. Such framings obscure points of contact between sound and deaf studies. We wish here to explore zones of productive articulation. Far from being peripheral, sound also penetrates deaf worlds. Carol Padden and Tom Humphreys write about the ways deaf children learn about the significance of sound to the hearing. They tell of deaf people being told to regulate and censor their own voices, and of learning about the shame associated with some bodily noises. For Padden and Humphreys, a sound barrier exists between deaf and hearing people. Similarly, Howland writes about the difference between hearing and deaf worlds by arguing that communities of hearing people hear together and hear same, or have the same ability to hear. For such deaf studies scholars, the way around sound is attending to deaf people's visual orientations. In such an approach, deaf people are, as Veditz put it, first, last, and all the time the people of the eye. One can find this articulation acquiring continued momentum in some online worlds, with the emergence of blogs such as Deaf World as I See It and Deaf Eye for the Hearing Guy. For much of deaf studies, deaf culture has a visual future, as evidenced by the National Science Foundation-funded Visual Language and Visual Learning Center at Gallaudet University, a major center for deaf undergraduate and graduate education, where research is conducted on deaf people's visual learning practices. Such programs as the Michigan-based Deaf Music Camp encourage deaf teens to experiment with music through deaf eyes, which includes seeing in addition to feeling music. Sound studies scholars might undo oldest notions of music by examining such practices expanding what it means to have an acoustemology, a sonic way of knowing and being in the world that expands beyond a limited definition of the auditory. Emerging alongside strategies of inferring sound or valorizing the visual is a practice of tuning into the zone of low-frequency vibration. This is a zone in the frequency spectrum where hearing and deaf scholars have recently been meeting in order to unsettle the ear-centrism of sound studies and the visually centered epistemology of much deaf studies. One data point for thinking about this attention to infrasound is the work of artist and sculptor Wendy Jacob, who in April 2009 organized a conference at MIT entitled Waves and Signs, a workshop on low-frequency vibration co-organized by faculty and students from Gallaudet University, along with MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies. The idea was to refuse a simple hearing, non-hearing binary by pitching the discussion, quite materially, down to a frequency register in which all parties could hear by feeling sound. For this event, Jacob built a raised 12 by 12 foot platform through which sound and infrasound was transduced. The workshop might be understood as an intervention in what Steve Goodman, aka dubstep artist Code 9, in his book Sonic Warfare, Sound, Affect, and the Ecology of Fear, calls the politics of frequency. Goodman's interest in very low sounds, sounds that edge from hearing into tactility, has him developing concepts such as infrasound or base materialism, an intriguing place for new encounters of sound studies and deaf studies, since it moves away from purely audiological conceptions of sound, talks notions of shared experience, and queries connections between mediation and experience. Technologically mediated transduced vibration might recall us to a device at the heart of debates about deaf relations to sound, the cochlear implant. Deaf scholars and activists have in the last decades participated in an impassioned debate about this technology. The most heated debates around this technology center on whether it is acceptable for parents to choose implant surgery for deaf children. Some of the cochlear implant users, however, have lately been staking out another position, one Mara Mills calls deaf futurism. Here, cochlear implants are technologies that betoken new human-machine interfaces, with the deaf at the vanguard of a networked posthumanism. If cochlear implants, for example, can be used to port into virtual worlds, then people with implants are at the forefront of a sonic cyborgian embodiment, with hearing people left behind in an unaugmented state. Many implant recipients have ambivalent relationships with what this technology means for their identities and abilities, especially since, through implantation, they become biomedical subjects and consequently are more likely to identify as being disabled. More, the question remains as to what kind of relation a cochlear-implanted cyborg might have to the sociality of sign language and other deaf social forms. Studies of sign language would seem to offer little intersection with sound studies, since here questions of visuality are paramount and sound has no clear relevance. We would like to experiment, however, with the notion that spoken and signed language both concern articulation. For phoneticians who make their living tracking the sounds of speech, articulatory phonetics details the physiological motion of parts of the vocal tract in the production of speech. Sign language also operates through a process of articulation. Though here not of bodily managements of the flow of air via the larynx, glottis, tongue, and teeth, but rather through the positioning of fingers, hands, and facial expressions in space and time. Sound studies and deaf studies have also been interested in transcending spoken language as a starting point in creating social worlds, an interest evidenced in some recent ethnography and cultural history. Sign language, then, is not only a language. Deaf social practices and aspirations are articulated within its transmission. Studies of signing and sign language using communities analyze deaf poetics and narrative, the formation of deaf social and political organizations, integrated deaf and hearing sign language communities, myths surrounding utopic integrated sign language communities in which both hearing and deaf people are purported to sign, or ideas of deaf development, the emergence of deaf-administered structures and institutions that are premised upon valuing sign language, helping other deaf people, and sharing and working collectively. Attending to different degrees, kinds, genres, and articulations of perceiving sound, however, can open up new ways of hearing with and being with, complicating deaf studies' attachment to the deaf-deaf same, a phrase translated from sign language, indicating an experience on the part of the signer of similitude with other deaf people. Deaf-blind studies challenge the hegemony of the visual and auditory by centering attention on the possibilities and politics of tactile sign language. Goodman proposes the notion of unsound to refer, among other things, to that which is not yet audible, to sonic virtuality, and to the nexus of imperceptible vibration. He means primarily to attend to the infrasonic and the ultrasonic as zones at the fuzzy periphery of auditory perception, where sound is inaudible but still produces neuroeffects or physiological resonances. In so doing, he stays near the realm of sound, canonically conceived, but he also opens up space to think about the not yet articulated. From Sophie Woolley to Inigo Wilkins. I had an advanced bionics cochlear implant recently, and yesterday it was switched on. It's exciting and will help me hear better. Over the next few weeks, I will be having hearing rehab to train my brain to use the implant. I'm having a party on Saturday, 14th September, to celebrate my 40th birthday. It's in Bethnal Green. I'll send a proper invitation soon. I feel like I'm beginning a new life as a cyborg, so it's really my first birthday. One again, diary that. The surgery was quick, an hour and a half. I recovered quickly without much pain or side effects. After switch on yesterday, I could hear my voice, which rapidly sounded more like my voice as the second went by. It was as if my brain was decoding and descrambling some 1990s bleepy electronica and turning it into speech, vocoder style. When I speak, R2, D2 simultaneously mimics my words in bleep language. These bleeps will go away in time as my brain rehabilitates to the high frequencies that were missing for years. Speech will sound more natural in time. I'm exposing myself to lots of sounds, training my brain to interpret the electrical signals that are being sent to my auditory nerve via electrodes inserted into my right side cochlea. Traffic sounds like cars made of skidding bleeps, although yesterday after many motorbikes, one sounded farty instead of bleepy, more like a motorbike. This demonstrates the process of habituation. It's an adventure. Getting implanted felt like a drastic option, but meeting an implanted person who had been deafened like myself swung it in the end. He said he'd got his life back and had never looked back. He could speak to people on the phone and everything. After many tests, the surgeon and audiologist said unreservedly that an implant would help me a lot, more than hearing aids, and that I would do very well. But it was still tough to suspend my disbelief and believe surgery would work for me, not after so many years of adapting and managing my expectations about my hearing. It was tough to dare hope I could reverse what I'd lost, because to hope is to expose myself to having those hopes dashed, which I eventually decided I'd be fine with. Fine, dash my hopes, I said. I love all that dashing stuff. It's like music to me. From Sophie Woolley to Inigo Wilkins. What can I hear? What does it all sound like? So much changes every day, over the seconds sometimes. I am in a near constant state of awe. I've gone from feeling like a happy cyborg because of all the techno noises I was hearing, to feeling like I'd gone back in time or entered the body of a parallel I, a more hearing me. There have been plenty of perplexed pauses in conversations this week, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. Listening to whole sentences without butting in to say, "Can you say it again?" and instead just letting the words tumble in, like I can hear or something, like one of the dreams I used to have about being able to hear. I keep reminding myself not to monologue at people, to ask questions and listen instead. At the same time, I'm really excited and want to tell people everything I'm hearing, what they sound like, how they sound like a smurf, a robot, how they sound like themselves. As the days go by, I'm telling more and more people that they sound like them. But how does the computer, the implant, know how people sound? People have written to ask what the implant sounds like and what it does for me. Is it just a powerful hearing aid, or is it a cure? Kind of both. Next week, I hope Ultra Zoom will be enabled on my CI. This is for zooming in at people at dinner parties and cutting out everyone else, a skill humans do not possess and is a feature exclusive to the advanced bionic NADA processor. I've gone back in time. I haven't gone hearing. I've reverted to being hard of hearing. Sometimes I can hear and sometimes I don't know what the hell is going on. My brain naturally prefers to understand speech over lip reading because it's easier. So when the sound suddenly malfunctions because of background noise or the wrong setting maybe, then I tumble back to deafness. It's worth noting now that I'm still deaf, more deaf as the implant destroys residual hearing, and I cannot revert to hearing aids if the device fails. I still use sign language with friends and family. At night, I take off the implant and cannot hear anything at all. But when I'm switched on, I'm like a hard of hearing person at the moment. I remember what that's like because I went from hearing to profoundly deaf. I went to a party with the Clear Voice program switched on and had a fun time. I was flabbergasted. I had fun. Eerie and eerie doubles. The seashell was a whisperer of secrets, a vulval threshold, and sometimes, reversing identification as an organ of speech, an ear, or even a nascent telephone. I saw the seashell's lips burn like a flame when the wave chased and caught it with a breath of laughter, and whispered in its ear the ocean name that it sings over and over forever after. Avenel L. Holmes, A Beautiful Life, 1871. Such ear-shell connections were in the making earlier, rendering this whole history perhaps more spiral than linear, with symbolisms washing to and fro, especially in the devious-sounding devices that are poems. Paduan anatomist Gabriele Fallopio described the spiral cavity in the inner ear in 1561, called it the cochlea, Latin for snail. Ear-seashell analogies remain saturated with the oceanic. Tara Rogers explains that the ear has been construed as holding an ocean within. The term ear canal itself evokes a channel of water for navigation, an arm of the sea. She reports that physicist James Jeans, in his 1937 Science and Music, advanced a vibrant analogy of sound and water waves that transposed this turbulent fluidity of the sounding world onto the interior of the subject. Jeans wrote, "Sound reaches our ears in the form of waves which have traveled through the surrounding air, much as waves travel over the surface of a sea or river. Some of these waves travel down the inch-long backwater formed by the auditory canal and finally encounter the eardrum, which forms a barrier at the far end. The shell operates at once as mouth, damp and resonant grotto, and doppelganger ear, an eerie object becoming, never entirely, a disenchanted scientific thing." Walter Benjamin played with the notion that shells contain worldly echoes, writing in the 1930s about his childhood around 1900, quote, "Like a mollusk in its shell, I held my abode in the 19th century, which now lies hollow before me like an empty shell," end quote. Imagining he could hold that century to his ear, he asked, what do I hear? Answering, the brief clatter of the anthracite as it falls from the coal shuttle into a cast iron stove, the dull pop of the flame as it ignites in the gas mantle, and the clinking of the lampshade on its brass ring when a vehicle passes by on the street, and other sounds as well, like the jingling of the basket of keys or the ringing of the 2 bells at the front and back steps. Robert Ryder suggests that what Benjamin hears in the conch are the primordial murmurings of the universe, but in the form of their smallest acoustical singularities. This, argues Ryder, is the acoustical unconscious or unconscious, but Benjamin's is also a moment in Euroconchology in which shells concentrate memory by gathering the history of the vibrating world around them. We have the meeting of 2 models for seashell sound. A mythic model that has seashells as channels for voices from a communal past, and a materialist model that has seashells as resonant chambers of individual located experience. We went into the dome. It was warm inside, warm and dark. Light entered from the passage to the dining room, but it wasn't enough to blot out the stars from the lattice of triangular panes overhead. It was almost like being out in the open. Pink quickly pointed out the positional etiquette within the dome. It wasn't hard to follow, but I still tended to keep my arms and legs pulled in close so I wouldn't trip someone by sprawling into a walk space. My misconceptions got me again. There was no sound but the soft whisper of flesh against flesh, so I thought I was in the middle of an orgy. I had been at them before, in other communes, and they looked pretty much like this. I quickly saw that I was wrong, and only later found out that I had been right, in a sense. What threw my evaluations out of whack was the simple fact that group conversation among these people had to look like an orgy. The much subtler observation that I made later was that with 100 naked bodies sliding, rubbing, kissing, caressing, all at the same time, what was the point in making a distinction? There was no distinction. What with all the touching, I quickly got an erection, which embarrassed me quite a bit. I was berating myself for being unable to keep sexual responses out of it, for not being able to operate on the same intellectual plane I thought they were on. When I realized that with some shock, that the couple next to me was making love. They had been doing it for the last 10 minutes, actually, and it had seemed such a natural part of what was happening that I had known it and not known it at the same time. No sooner had I realized it than I suddenly wondered if I was right. Were they? It was very slow and the light was bad, but her legs were up and he was on top of her. That much I was sure of. It was foolish of me, but I really had to know. I had to find out what the hell I was in. How could I give the proper social responses if I didn't know the situation? Now, this is going to sound crazy, I know. It sounded pretty crazy to me when I thought of it. It dawned on me with a sort of revelation that her word for talk and mine were miles apart. She could read words or emotions in every twitch of my muscles like a lie detector. Sound, to her, was only a minor part of communication. It was something she used to speak to outsiders. Pink talked with her whole being. I didn't even have the half of it, even then, but it was enough to turn my head entirely around in relation to these people. They talked with their bodies. It wasn't all hands, as I'd thought. Any part of the body in contact with any other was communication. Sometimes a very simple and basic sort. Think McLuhan's light bulb as the basic medium of information, perhaps saying no more than "I am here." But talk was talk, and if conversation evolved to the point where you needed to talk to another with your genitals, it was still a part of the conversation. What I wanted to know was, what were they saying? I knew even at that dim moment of realization that it was more than I could grasp. Sure, you're saying. You know about talking to your lover with your body as you make love. That's not such a new idea. Of course it isn't, but think how wonderful that talk is even when you're not primarily tactile oriented. Can you carry the thought from here? Or are you doomed to be an earthworm thinking about sunsets? I knew I had to stay and learn to speak. It might make sense to argue the polar opposite, that we listen only too well. In other words, instead of joining in the chorus of those who lament our era's alleged hearing loss, only to better dismiss the modern project all told, what is required is a more dynamic elaboration of the concept of modernity through hearing. To talk about hearing in material terms is to acknowledge the fact, as Bruno Latour insists, that the material world always comes to us in cognizable forms. It is to look for deeper interpenetration of the biological and the cultural, and to complicate tripartite sender-medium-receiver models that situate seeing or hearing somewhere in the middle between the polar forces of nature, or what Mitchell glosses as genetically determined capacity on the one hand, and society, or in Mitchell's phrase, a programmed set of automatisms on the other. One way to do this is to foreground the ear's rich physicality, independent of the signs and meanings that the organ may mediate. Listening, Bott remarks in his famous essay, speaks. As such, listening is a psychological act, distinguished from hearing, which is a purely physiological phenomenon. The roots of auditory Aufmerksamkeit, or attention, for instance, can now be squarely traced to Kantian transcendental aesthetics, and possibly earlier, to the invention of silent, motionless listening protocols during the French and German Enlightenment. Even though his interest in the ear never crystallized into a coherent theory, much less a major study along the lines of his groundbreaking optical work, La Dioptrique, 1637, Descartes did ponder, if frequently in a rather roundabout manner, and, to be sure, always with the broader problem of the mind-body relationship uppermost in his mind, the deeper association of some with sonus. In fact, instead of the alleged exclusion of the ear from the search for truth, Descartes' philosophy enacts an uneasy truce between cogito and audio, a precarious entente between entendre, hearing, and entendre, understanding. More than a thought experiment, Descartes' nocturnal ruminations can thus be interpreted as a psychosonic exercise, setting off what one might call the philosopher's lifelong and never quite completed quest for resonance, for the joining together of reason and resonance in a new concept of personhood. The score, John Cage's 433. The manuscript of Musicae Compendium by René Descartes. Bruno Munari, Speak Italian, The Fine Art of Gesture. Sign writing notation poster. Image from William Dartham, The Art of Talking with the Fingers. ASL signed educational film by George Vedetz. Poster, Charles Michel de la Paix and the Deaf Mute. Children's book by Eric Carle, Polar Bear, What Do You Hear? Video of a model trying Bless's sound perfume orchestra scarf. Man holding a tree in the last scene of Werner Herzog's The Land of Silence and Darkness. Francesco Clemente, Map of What is Effortless. Barbara Blum, Fingering an Idea. Auditory bone structures in Hieronymus Fabricius's Of Vision, Voice, and Audition. Hergé, Tintin and the Calculus Affair. John Bulwer, Philocophus, On Hearing Through Teeth. Frederick Rain, Acoustic Throne. Bless's Sound Perfume, Orchestra Hammock. Man Ray, Mathematical Objects. Ear Trumpet. Man Ray, Mathematical Objects. Man Ray, Mathematical Objects. Andrei Tarkovsky, Andrei Rublev, Bell Forging Scene. Whale Eardrum. Syrinx aruanus, Sea Snail Shell. Man Ray, Mathematical Objects. Anathesius Kirchner, Dionysus's Cave. An oral annunciation. Man Ray, Cocteau and Zara with lampshade. Modelization of the inner part of a cochlear implant. Prepared piano for Peter Ablinger's Quadraturin 3. Image of hair cells. Sonic weapon against riots. Acoustic mirror. Golden record from NASA Voyager interstellar mission. Thank you.